Hi there, welcome to our third video on basic keyboard skills. Hopefully you're learning a lot. Our first video was on sight reading, very important part of this instrument. You know, when you want to play the snare drum, you want to play the drum set, so much of it is just reading rhythms. But it's just not reading the rhythms here. You really have to learn to handle all the clefs, ledger lines, and all those things. So make sure you're working on your sight reading. Our second video, we covered the universal percussion principles as they're applied to the keyboard: grip, lever, playing spot, and stroke. So hopefully you're learning as you come to every new percussion instrument to apply those 4 skills to every instrument you play. Now this video is going to focus on scales and arpeggios, which are the rudiments of the keyboard instruments. So on the snare drum we have flams and paradiddles and drags and rolls and ratomacues and all of those rudiments. And if you know those rudiments, you can play rudimental snare drum music. And sometimes we think that it's only the snare drum that has rudiments, but every instrument, every percussion instrument has a core set of small motives, rudiments of what you have to play, and in this case it's the scales and arpeggios. So you have to spend a lot of time on your scales and arpeggios, so when you're reading a piece of music, because you're now a good sight reader, you recognize, there's my C major scale. I know my C major scale, and you'll just immediately play it. It's the same way when you're playing a rudimental snare drum piece and you encounter a paradiddle. You don't necessarily read the paradiddle, you know how to play the paradiddle, and your brain just snaps to, oop, I play a paradiddle, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, and the paradiddle is done because you've practiced your paradiddle. The scales and the arpeggios are much the same way. So this is just introductory. Maybe you know your scales and arpeggios already, but just to go over it for everybody, to make sure everybody's on the same page. We have a couple of different scales. We have the major scale and the minor scale. That's primarily the scales we play. Most people start with the major scales, and it's the combination of different steps, whole steps and half steps. So when you're understanding your keyboard here, and you can find your C, which is right off of the 2 accidentals, the C sharp and the E flat. C to C sharp is a half step. C to D is a whole step. There is no note between. If there's no note between 2 consecutive notes, it's a half step. So if you're following along with me here, and you can say this with me: C, C sharp, half step. C sharp to D, half step. D to D sharp, E flat, same note, different name for it, half step. Now between the E and the F, it's only a half step. There's no note between. There, in this case, is no, in traditional terms, E sharp. That's just the F. So our major scale, as most of you know, is made up of 2 whole steps, a half step, 3 whole steps, and a half step. Generally, people would say whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, and that's what we know is the major scale. Now, the easiest major scale probably to figure out is our C major scale, and it follows that exact pattern that I just mentioned. So we start with the C, and then we go up a whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. And there's our C major scale. Which I just played going up or ascending and coming down descending. Now, in this Western culture, our ears have been trained to know what a major scale sounds like, and I think we should use that to our benefit. So let's say I want to now figure out my E flat major scale. Well, I know, here's my E flat. Now it's a little tricky. I have to go up a whole step first, so that's not the next note. Remember, that's a half step. So E flat, I go whole, whole, half, whole, whole. Now, let's say I've just forgotten what I'm doing here, and I'm going to start that again. Hopefully your ear just heard that that wasn't the right note. I'm going to do it again. Doesn't that note sound just kind of wrong? Well, it's not fitting into our whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half pattern. We needed this note, not that note. Now, this isn't necessarily the best or the only way to figure out your scales, but do trust your ear. You've heard major scales your whole life, and so you'll know when you play the major scale or not. So when we come to the keyboard and we're learning our scales and we're learning our arpeggios and we're learning the sight read, and then we put all that together and we learn some pieces of music, I tend to think about knowing the notes in 3 different ways. Okay, so a lot of people just come up to the keyboard and they're just like, well, I'll play this one over here. I don't know what that is, but I know I have to play that one, right? And I think it's important to know the notes, to actually know the name of every note you're playing. So for instance, I just played the E flat major scale. Well, what do I know about the E flat major scale? I know that it's E flat, F, G, A flat, B flat, C, D, E flat. I know those notes. I could write those notes. I have them memorized, right? So I think that's the first thing, to know the notes. So often people come to the keyboard and they think, okay, the first scale I play is C. I think I can do that. It's just all the naturals. But really know those notes. You know those notes are C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, B, A, G, F, E, D, C. Know the notes. Practice saying the notes. Okay? The next thing is to know where the notes are located on the keyboard. Now, if you're new to the keyboard, that takes a little bit of time. If you've been playing the keyboard for a while, you might think, well, what do you mean? I know where that note is. But I think there's a visual knowledge of knowing those notes. So, and I tend to think about these in terms of shapes. So the C major scale is just a line straight up the accidentals and back down. But the E flat major scale is not a straight line. It's an accidental, 2 natural, 2 accidentals, 2 naturals, and an accidental. So it kind of has this shape to it, and I know what that shape looks like. I know that E flat starts here, down to the naturals, up accidentals, down to naturals. So I've become familiar of knowing where those notes are. And then the third thing I have to teach myself to do is to accurately play those notes and know how to strike them, striking them on the good playing spots, like we spoke about in the last video. And that takes practice as well. So again, this is just maybe a different way for you to think about coming to the keyboard and knowing the notes, to know what the names of the notes are, where they are, and how to strike them. Okay, so there's a little breakdown of our scales, how to create the major scale, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. You should be able to do that on any note. So let's just take, let's take a hard one. Let's take B major. So we don't count the first note as the step. So we go whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. And my ear tells me that that's right. So there's our scale approach. The next thing you should learn is to learn how to play the arpeggio, which is the first, third, and fifth note of the scale. It's what makes up the chord of the scale. So if I go back to C major, there's my scale, but I also need to know the most important notes of that scale, which make up the chord, the C major chord, and it's the first note, the third note, which is E, the fifth note, which is G, and repeat the top note, the octave. And that turns into a very nice exercise pattern. Kind of sounds like I'm playing triplets. And so it's important to play both the scale and the triplets. I'll go back to E flat major. Jump over to B major, which I did earlier. So you want to know both the scale and the arpeggio as your beginning basis and beginning practicing of your scales and your arpeggios. In our next video, we're going to talk about playing these scales in a couple of different ways that will kind of help us organize them, and we'll take it from there.